A little late again, but we're here with you. And we're going to talk today about three very important progressive presidents. That is, a period in time in which both the Republicans and the Democrats agreed that there was a need for reform. The great book about this is Richard Hofstadter's Age of Reform. And he starts early. He starts with a very strange man, William Jennings Bryan, who in the end of the 19th century was the leader of a very populist party out of the Midwest. And he blended finally in with the Democrats and became their candidate several times. But before all that happened, we had to have an assassination. So we have another problem. We have McKinley, who had been president for 4 years and ran again and then was assassinated. And we have his vice president then become president. The vice president was Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy in and of himself was a jubilant, outdoorsy type. So he had not been a healthy child. He'd gone west, turned himself into a kind of cowboy, and sort of ran his administration as if he were a cowboy. He certainly was an imperialist, and he was often attacked by the man who was on the other side, Williams Jennings Bryan. Williams Jennings Bryan was a man who wanted us not to go into the Spanish-American War, but the press barons, particularly in California, the man who ran the San Francisco newspapers, wanted the war to happen, as did Pulitzer out of St. Louis. And so we had the war, and we took our colonies, those colonies being the formal colonies being Puerto Rico and the Philippines, the informal colonies being many of the Caribbean islands, for which our good president, Teddy Roosevelt, decided to have a corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And more or less translated into terms you can understand, it was that no one else could mess around in the Americas but us. And he did mess around with the Central American states and the islands of the Caribbean in such a way that we got a very bad reputation for years later for our obstreperous ways of handling problems for them, unwanted by them. But let me start with Teddy's life in the White House. You know, presidents are just ordinary people who happen to get to be president. And in the case of most of them, they have children. So you have all those Byrd children from the Johnson years. There was Lady Byrd herself, then Linda Byrd, then Lucy Byrd. It sounded like an Avery, but it was in fact the Johnson extended family. The Nixons had girls, Eisenhower had a son, and in the case of Teddy Roosevelt, he had the most unbelievable daughter. Let me tell you what Alice, little blue gown Alice, did. She did everything she wanted to do, regardless of what she was told to do. For instance, Teddy Roosevelt was a great outdoorsman, and he was determined to found a huge number of national parks, which he did do. In fact, his big carved face is up there at Mount Rushmore. And he did a lot of national forests also. And so when he was in the White House, he announced to the children, there will be no Christmas tree. We're not cutting down and wasting another tree. And so when night came, little Alice got out of her bed, woke up her little brother. They climbed out the window of the White House and went over to Rock Creek Park with an axe and cut down a Christmas tree. And they dragged it back across Pennsylvania Avenue and dragged it back into the White House. So when Teddy woke up the next day, although he had declared there would be no Christmas tree, there was a Christmas tree in the White House. And this is the work of Alice, who grew up in the White House, It was hard to handle as a little girl, and it was worse as a big girl. She ended up marrying the person who was the head of the party in the House of Representatives. So she was now Alice Roosevelt Longworth, wife of the Speaker. And she was mean to everybody. Once, when Dick Nixon came by to take her to an affair, he knocked on the door, came in and said, "I'm here to pick you up, Alice." She gave him a steely look and said, "My hairdresser calls me Alice, and some of my better friends call me Alice, but you can call me Mrs. Longworth." End of Dick Nixon. Then later, she ran across Robert Kennedy, and she said to him in a very loud voice, "I'm so tired of you Irish people pretending you have all these heirs. You're nothing but a bunch of shanty Irish who came here after the potato revolution." Robert Kennedy never spoke to her again, not that it bothered her. She was even mean to people in her own family. She was at a party once and she said, "Oh, any moment now, my cousin," she was talking about Eleanor Roosevelt, "will enter the room. You'll know she's coming because her teeth will come into the room before she does." This was a picture of what it was like to live with Alice Roosevelt Longworth. And Teddy learned to live with her. He also had to live with the fact that in this country at that time, people were suffering, and they were suffering because of the large number of trusts that had been built by large corporate structures. In fact, between the years of the late 19th century, let's take 1890 to 1910, there were more corporations formed during those years than at any other time in American history. And these were very large corporate structures known as trusts, another word for monopoly. Let me tell you about the Standard Trust, one of the great targets of the Teddy Roosevelt years. John Rockefeller would send his minions out to open a gas station at a certain place across the street from another gas station. And then once he was set up, he would reduce prices even below his cost, which would drive the competition across the street out of business. And then he'd buy it up cheap. And in no time, he owned all the gas stations as well as the gas production. This was Standard Trust. And the government of the progressives were determined to break up these huge trusts, and they did. There are two pieces of legislation that helped them: the Sherman Antitrust Law and the Clayton Antitrust Law. And by the time they got their hands on the Rockefeller Trust, Standard Oil, they broke it into 10 pieces. The problem with oil and gas at that time was it just beginning to take over the American economy, so it was at the beginning of an exponential growth. And so the 8 babies that grew out of the Standard, like Sohio, they soon, within 10 years, became larger than the parent they were broken away from. But nevertheless, there was this attempt to bring down these large corporate structures, to make them competitive and to open the market and keep prices low. There was another problem in the country. These problems can be attended to by reading 2 wonderful short books. One was railroad legislation, one was food legislation. Let's take railroad initially. The book is The Octopus, which was written by a Berkeley graduate. The octopus basically meant the large railroad trust, because once they were in power, they moved to help big movers and to hurt and harm small movers. And this was particularly true when you were moving a lot of grain to harvest, because it was very important to have the railroad carry this grain from the wheat fields to the places it was needed. And so Teddy Roosevelt looked at this and said, this is not right. And so he passed the Hepburn Act. And the Hepburn Act actually opened up and forced the railroads, using the Interstate Commerce Act, to run a fair deal for both small and large producers. And all this you can attribute to a man out of Berkeley who wrote a book, The Octopus, obviously referring to the giant railroad trust in California. That railroad trust, when it was broken up, gave us some very important buildings and people. For instance, Mark Hopkins was one of them, and he left us a wonderful hotel in San Francisco where you can go to the top of the Mark and have a martini and watch the fog drift in through the Golden Gate. The other was Leland Stanford, who gave us a small college down on the peninsula in Palo Alto. And then there was even a man down in Southern California who had been part of this trust, and he gave us a great art museum where you can go see the collection, particularly of British art, that he was able to bring to the United States. Pieces like the Boo Boy and Pinky, a little English British girl in a pink dress. All this is part of this move against these trusts. Now, the Chicago problem was even worse. And there we had a man, Upton Sinclair, basically a journalist who wrote for a rotogravure. This is a kind of newspaper they had in Chicago. And he wrote an expose of the meatpacking business. And people couldn't believe what they were seeing in this newspaper. It appeared that we had absolute pollution in the meatpacking business. The way the meatpackers lived was terrible, and what they had to live with was even worse. There were rats all over the place where the meat was produced. Rats often fell off the ceiling and got ground up with the hamburger. People lost a finger, and the finger went right into the hamburger or the hot dog. We really had terrible, terrible production by very important Chicago. You know, Chicago is a funny town. Most of the Chicago royalty, as they call themselves, were meatpackers. And they lived in splendid houses along the lake shore, but they ran a crummy business. And so when this story got out and then became a book, people were horrified to see that rats or their droppings, or when they dropped, or a finger fell into the whole process. It was terrible. And so we have the Food and Drug Act, something that Mr. Roosevelt was very interested in and lives with us today. It also covers medicines. It turned out that many medical supplies were contaminated. And this was not to be tolerated, particularly by the up-and-coming American middle class, who demanded better of their country than this shoddy production. So you have two books, The Octopus and also The Jungle, which helped very much the progressive cause, because this was a cause that was running both the Republican and the Democratic parties in the time of 1900 to 1920, when these three presidents were in office. And the man who stood behind them was a very strange man, William Jennings Bryan. He'd come out of the Midwest. He saw that people were suffering there. He initially made a very famous speech in 1890. He said he would not allow you, meaning the big giants, to crucify his people on a cross of gold, the famous cross of gold speech. He was for bimetallism, in other words, the coinage also of silver, because there was a great amount of silver that was spread more widely than gold was spread. He stayed as a thorn in the side of Teddy Roosevelt. He was very opposed to Teddy's imperialist ambitions abroad. At the end, though, he made a serious mistake. He was a devoutly religious man, And he was very much opposed to the teaching in school of the theories of Darwin. And so in a very famous trial, the Scopes trial, he takes on the side that is anti-Darwin, anti-science. And it's really amazing because by the 20th century, America had recognized that the age of science was here. In fact, it was the scientific method that had made the West, that's the whole of the West, Western Europe, Germany, France, Britain, the United States, the Scandinavian countries, had made them the modern day wonders, even to this very day. I suggest that you take a trip down to Southern California, way down. Try San Diego. Near the San Diego campus of the University of California is a magnificent research center built on the foundings of a wonderful man who gave us the polio vaccine. And here you find people today working very hard using the scientific method to see if they can do something about this damnable epidemic we're living through. But you do this in a very serious way, and you become a people of science. And for some reason, that never hit Brian, and so he defended the other side and lost against Clarence Darrow. This also turns into a very wonderful movie some 20 years later called Inherit the Wind, where you get to hear the same argument again. Those who want to believe that Darwin is wrong, because Darwin cannot be found, his theory cannot be found in the Bible. And since the Bible is the book, therefore he must be wrong. And in fact, he was right. So William Jennings Bryan did not end his famous career on a high note, but on a low note. And we have people even today who don't believe in science and therefore are always trashing the results of very serious scientists who are trying desperately to work on a very serious question: why so many of our people are dying from COVID. But back to the progressives. They were there to change the world. They changed railroad legislation so that you had a fair and even way to get. We just had an interruption, but we're back together again. So you have the railroads regulated now, interstate commerce up to date. You have a reinvigoration of the legislation, the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Clayton Antitrust Act. You have all these things happening around and about these very, very progressive people who want a better America and want it reformed. As again, Hofstadter says in his brilliant book, The Age of Reform. Reform was with us, here to stay, to make a better place. Now, the first two presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, an accidental president because we lost McKinley, and then Taft. Taft becomes the president after Teddy, and they came together in friendship, but in no time that friendship broke. Teddy Roosevelt's a very interesting guy. He was a vice president. He was then a president. He was then a Supreme Court justice, not just any justice, but in Harding's day, that is at the beginning of the next 10-year period, the period of the Jazz Age, the first president of that age, Harding, made Taft the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in a job in which he stayed for 10 years, the entire length of the Jazz Age. And then he felt ill, stepped down from his office, and died within a month of his retirement. It was a very, very unusual career. He also left a son who became Mr. Republican, and who was the man everyone thought would get the nomination from the Republican Party in 19 in the Eisenhower time. And he didn't, of course, because the Republicans were so desperate to get in the White House, they'd do anything. So they found Eisenhower, who they didn't think was even a Republican, and they nominated him, and he got in. And Robert Taft did not. Now, when you get to the end of the Taft time, Teddy has become disenchanted. Number one, he left the country for a long time. He traveled broadly. He went to Africa. He shot lots of game, something that we would look askance at today. He did, in fact, bring many of these big animals that he had shot, elephants, lions, etc., back and gave them to museums like the Smithsonian, so that with taxidermy, they could put these animals up for display. Nevertheless, he was invited when he came back from Africa to stay in the White House, but he turned the invitation down because he was not happy with many things that our man Taft was doing. And the split became open. So at the convention to renominate, he thought, himself, Taft, for another term, there was a split. And Teddy Roosevelt, with his group, organized a new party called in shorthand the Bull Moose Party. It was a second Republican Party, if you wish, holding to many of the same principles. And this split, of course, is godsend to the Democrats, because if you're going to have two Republican parties splitting the Republican vote, by sheer accident, you're going to have the election of Woodrow Wilson. And sure enough, Wilson comes in to the White House. Wilson's a very strange man. He's the eighth of 8 Virginia presidents, and he is as touched by racism as all 8 of them were. He grew up in a Presbyterian household. His father was a Presbyterian minister. They lived in the manse in Northern Virginia. Then they moved to Georgia, to the Deep South. Then Wilson himself went up and in his due time was president of Princeton University. He was also governor of New Jersey. By the way, someone corrected me last week by pointing out to me that the man that I had said was born in Maine, and this is Mr. Coolidge, was in fact born in Vermont, that French-named little tiny state that we just pronounce as Vermont. And she's right. I did misplace him one state over. So I apologize to all of you Green Mountain people who are out there on the birthing place of the famous president. But now back to Wilson. Strange as he was, growing up as he did, he had many flukes in his character. But one, he was open-minded to some aspects of a changing America. And so he had the moral courage to nominate the first Jewish man to the Supreme Court. And oy vey, was this something when it hit the Senate. And it took a year to get the approval through. But in fact, it did in fact happen. And so you have this man now nominated and now approved. He becomes a very famous member of the court. And you have to understand that anti-Semitism in the United States was a late vice. The first large number of Jews that came to this country came from Germany. where they were very much assimilated into German society. And they came because they were very unhappy with conditions in Europe. The conditions in Europe they were unhappy was that they had put all of their hopes and aspirations into the revolution of 1848, one of the many revolutions that first started in Paris, 1789, 1830, and then 1848. And in 1848, the aspirations of the liberal cause went down to defeat. And so a large number of Jewish people decided that's that. And they came to the United States. And they did not stop, as many later Jews did, poor Jews, in Brooklyn, the Bronx, or Manhattan. They went anywhere they wanted to in the country. And so it was that this man, Brandeis, his family went directly to St. Louis. They were not from New York. But when in fact this group of German Jews had in fact settled, there was then the arrival of a large number of Jewish people from the Pale, that is from Poland and European Russia. And these people in large measure spoke Yiddish. In large measure, they were poor. In large measure, they were nowhere near as educated as the German Jews. And so it was that the awful aspects of anti-Semitism took hold in this period late in the Progressive Era and continued to be a part of the problem that we had in modern America. That's a little side story on that aspect of it. The other aspect that was amazing was that Taft had been, as president, before his presidency, he had been the vice president. Before that, he had been the governor of the islands of the Philippines that we avariciously took over after the Spanish-American War and made them into our colony, not asking them whether they wanted to be run by us, which they did not, and they had a civil war about it, and we had to crush that civil war. No wonder Williams Jennings Bryan was so opposed to American imperialism. So now when he is president, that is President Taft, he becomes very pro-Catholic. He goes, in fact, to that place where we call it the Fighting Irish, and other people call it the University of Notre Dame. And he gives a speech there in which he praises the work of the Catholics, what they have done to bring order. He even went to California and praised the role of the missions in California, which is not something that we would do today, given that we know about the troublesome time of the missions and their role in the Indians' livelihood in the mission areas. But this president did this, and it surprised lots of people because the Irish had come after the Potato Revolution in the early part of the 19th century in large measure and in large numbers. And now they heard a president say pleasant things about Irish Catholics. And perhaps you also don't know that in the 19th century, we had a number of political parties, not just the Democrats and Republicans. We had the Whig Party, the great party that died over the issue of slavery. We also had a party that had a single agenda, if you can believe that. They were called the Know Nothing Party. And the agenda of the Know Nothing Party was totally to be against the Irish Catholics and how they should be driven out of the country. So here you have a party actually organized against you, if you are an Irish person, as I am, to drive you out of the United States. And now you have a president going to Notre Dame saying how wonderful these Catholics are. So it was a surprise to many, the changes in the Progressive Era about the nature. And this continued. For instance, in the very beginning of the Progressive Era, one of the things that Teddy Roosevelt decided to do was to invite Booker T. Washington to the White House to dine. You have no idea what a shockwave that went to many people. Booker T. Washington was an American black. He was an American who was very interested in education for African Americans. And he worked his entire life to aspire to that. And he would be very pleased to know that great universities grew up because of his work, like Howard University in Washington, D.C., which gave us one of the greatest of the people on the Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall. So you had people like that working, but you couldn't believe at the beginning of the 20th century that the President of the United States had invited a black man to come to the White House to dine. And he did it. You should keep that in mind when you hear about the reformers today who call themselves reformers, who want to knock the Teddy Roosevelt statue out of the Natural History Museum in New York, because he also was not in favor of all the things that we are in favor of today, but he did some good things. And one was certainly to speak up for the African American in his role as president in the very beginning of the 20th century, which did march on to see finally in this century we live in a black man as president and now a black woman as a candidate vice president. The changes we have gone under are amazing when you think about it, but people paid a cost for these changes. Now, in Wilson's day, while he did appoint Louis Brandeis to the court, and after a year, Brandeis finally got into the court and became a great justice, the first Jewish person. You know, we've made all these changes as the years go by. Sandra Day O'Connor, guess who appointed her? No less than Ronald Reagan. And then the first really strong Italian American, who would that be? A man who used to go to the opera with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a man who stood in the Supreme Court and said, there is no right to privacy in the Constitution. You can just imagine who I'm referring to. But Reagan appointed him too, two extremely different people to the court. And so it was that we get under Wilson, this man Brandeis, into the court situation. That's nothing compared to what our man in the year before him, Taft appointed 6 justices to the Supreme Court. In 4 years, he appointed 6. That means in some years he had to do 2 at a time to get all 6 onto the court. And then later, when he wants the job, he gets the job of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. An open gambling game going on between who wants what and who gets what. Now, going on with Wilson, as I suggested, he was touched by slavery. His mother rented slaves. That's right. If you owned an excess of slaves, you could rent them out. And Mrs. Wilson, living there with her husband and her son in this Presbyterian manse, the house that's given to the minister, is renting some slaves to help with the housework. It never, ever ends. 8 Virginians, all of them touched by slavery. And other than the Brandeis thing, let me give you an idea of what Wilson was like as a very prissy man. He was very much opposed to drinking, which meant he was not a favorite of German beer drinkers, of Italian wine drinkers, or of Irish liquor drinkers. And being opposed to drink, he had a Secretary of the Navy who was also opposed to drink. And they discovered lo and behold, that the U.S. Navy was keeping an old tradition alive, a tradition they had learned from the British Royal Navy when we were part of the British Empire. And that is that to this very day, in all British warships, every member of the crew is given a tote, a little tote of rum to drink, sometimes substituted by gin, scotch, but you always get your drink. And we continue that tradition. In fact, it got to the point in the British Royal Navy in the old days that the captain was often not paid a salary, but was given his salary in rum, kegs of rum, which he could then sell. This struck Wilson as sinful, as terrible. And then he and his Navy guy made it a criminal offense, forbid the serving of alcohol on any American warship. Not only did they find that out, at the same time they found out that the Navy always liked to go for land duty to New Orleans, because there was a place in New Orleans where naughty women could be found. It was called Storytown. And so they both, the Secretary of the Navy and the President of the United States, put pressure on the governor and on the mayor of New Orleans, the governor of Louisiana and the mayor of New Orleans, to close Storytown. And so they did close it. Now, if you know anything about naughty ladies, they simply move their business elsewhere. So it was that the Navy still came in to New Orleans as a port of call, and sailors still liked to be with naughty ladies. And so life went on, but not approved by either President Wilson or his Secretary of the Navy. These were actually tremendous flaws of an attempt to impose one's own deeply held religious views. If you don't want to drink, you don't have to drink. It's a free country. But to try and institutionalize it through government was bound to fail, and it did. But that was an indication of the problem that Wilson faced as his time in the White House. He also faced the fact, and we're going to talk about that next time, that the war that was to come came. That on a bad day in Sarajevo, the Archduke Ferdinand and his wife were assassinated. And that assassination brought on all the alliances, so that in a matter of weeks, as one British minister said, the lights in Europe have gone out. World War I started. The guns of August, 1914. And Wilson was determined, absolutely determined, to stay out of that war, no matter what happened. And Teddy Roosevelt, who was no longer in office of any kind, was absolutely determined that we would join the Allies in fighting the Central Powers of Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so it was, there was a constant sense of debate as to what the Americans should do. But there's very strong support for Wilson to keep out of the war. And it was made stronger by the fact that Wilson then had appointed William Jennings Bryan to be his Secretary of State. And William Jennings Bryan said this was the cause célèbre. If we should go into this war, he would resign his office. So serious was he in this anti-war feeling that was very dominant in our country. The Irish were opposed, and Irish Americans, because they said it was just a war to save the British Empire. And that was the last thing they were interested in. The German Americans, the German Bund, were certainly not willing to think about attacking Germany, their basic homeland. And so Wilson was sitting on a powder keg that was about to go off. But he held the line, and he got reelected President of the United States for a second term, still determined. He lived through terrible times. There was a great ocean liner that was to make its way across the Atlantic, even in a time when the weather conditions predicted icebergs. And so the great ship Titanic did sail. The great ship Titanic did hit an iceberg and go down. But no one could blame that on the Germans, the other side. But then there was another ship off the coast of Ireland, another ship carrying civilian passengers, the Lusitania. And the Lusitania was sent to the bottom by a German submarine, no questions asked. And on board the Lusitania was a rather famous American, John Jacob Astor. So now the question got closer at home. Wilson absolutely insisted and sent note after note to both sides in the war, that is, the French and British ally and the German-Austrian allies, Central Powers, that we Americans had the right to travel in those waters on neutral shipping, which was a challenge. Initially, the Germans seemed to accept this, that they would not sink these ships likely to have Americans on board, and limited their attacks. The submarines of these days are tiny little things, not very far underwater, very slow moving. And so they put their effort against food ships coming into Britain, because by then the British could not feed themselves. So it was thought to be a brilliant move on the part of the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, to aim themselves against British shipping only and shipping for freighters only, not passenger ships, to actually sink the British Isles because they would run out of food. And in fact, food was rapidly rationed in Britain because of that. But still, we stayed out, determined to stay out. Wilson was absolutely dead in his feet to stay out. The problem for the Wilson is that Wilson dies in office. The last year of his presidency, basically, his wife was the president of the United States. Horror of horrors, a woman running things. And he was heartbroken because he had finally gone in to win victory in a peace that would make an end to war, the war to end all wars, the Grande Guerre, as the French called it. Of course, it was only a dream. And out of that dream, he hoped to form a League of Nations. And he went to the treaty that was signed at the Great Palace outside Paris, Louis XIV's last great construction project known as the Palace at Versailles. And there in the Hall of Mirrors it signed the agreement with the defeated Central Powers. But none of this had come true for Wilson. So the last of the progressive presidents dies brokenhearted. The progressive movement itself had taken deep root in states as well as in the federal government. People like La Follette was a progressive, and so legislation continued, that is, progressive legislation continued at the state level in states like Wisconsin, which have always been noted for their progressive attitude towards things like labor, the organization of labor, healthcare, the organization of a healthcare program, way before we later have the arguments in our century about healthcare. So it was the progressive era came to a slow close. People were tired of reform. We had done what we could do. We had brought the railroads down to understand they had to service the small as well as the large. We had certainly let the food people know no more rats or fingers or droppings in our food products. The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, who later moved to California, by the way, and ran for governor here. This was not to be. We were going to have a Food and Drug Act. We were also going to watch over our medicine more carefully. Lots of people complain today about aspects of this very strict American view about, particularly in medicine. They would like to see it open a little. For instance, in the days when people were dying of AIDS, and there was a possibility of some cures not tested, there was a movement to allow people to take those voluntarily, even though they did not come with full approval of the FDA, because the FDA is very slow in bringing products to market. And so it was that there is that movement even today, even though there are people who suggest wild solutions for this epidemic we're living through, something that not even the FDA would agree to, but perhaps the White House would. The progressive period, a time of reform, a time to change America, because America was no longer the 19th century little island alone, floating in the world. It was a major power. It was an industrial power. And there were things that needed to be done about child labor, about women's labor. There's a wonderful book called The Golden Door. It's a story about two immigrant groups that come to the United States. One are Jewish immigrants and one are Italian immigrants. They come to their section of New York City that they know and where they can live with like-minded people. The Jewish immigrants to Hester Street. The Italian immigrants to their own street, Bleecker Street. There's even an opera by Menotti called The Saint of Bleecker Street. And these minorities lived there and they looked for jobs. And they found them in the newest industry in Manhattan. Yes, there used to be people who actually worked in Manhattan. It was the garment district. It's still there. 7th Avenue. And the garment district extends below 42nd Street for around 20 some blocks. And so the male of the family, as well as the female, went to work making garments, cheap textile garments. The difference between the two, according to the author of the Golden Door, is that the Italians saved their money, and when they'd made enough, they went back to Italy. That's what they had planned to do all along. They weren't going to stay in this wild country of America. They were going to go back to Bella Italia. And they did in large measure. They had the money. They could get themselves set up and live the rest of their lives in Italia. But the Jews had no place to go back to. So they had to stick it out, work it out. They even organized a union, the Ladies' Garment Union, had a very powerful voice in the union movement, had a very powerful woman go to Congress, Bella Abzug, strongly advocating for health conditions, work conditions, labor laws themselves, trying to make this giant, this new industrial giant work so that it benefited the bottom as well as the top, so that it actually gave people hope and aspirations for a better future, and it made for a better America. America made itself great through these processes. It didn't need anybody else to come along in the next century. It was what it was through the age of reform. And another age of reform is going, in fact, two are going to come. The 20th century is loaded with aggressive reformers. The next big age of reform, of course, is the New Deal, where Franklin Roosevelt is going to shake up everything. And then, when he hasn't done enough and he dies, Harry Truman will continue it. Then there'll be a quiet time, the Eisenhower time. And then there'll be a Texan, because JFK is, like McKinley, assassinated, and we get Lyndon Baines Johnson, and we get his great reform movement, which does push the envelope as far forward as possible. So we have a whole century of people taking a deep breath in between the ages of reform, the time of progressive presidents, Teddy Roosevelt to Wilson, with a stop-off in between with Taft, and then FDR and Mr. Truman, and then Lyndon Baines Johnson and the New Frontier and the Great Society, all packaged together to give you modern America. Time of change for all of us, a time in which at the end of the process and moving towards the century we live in today, you do have this wonderful sense that it's possible to make things better, that it's possible by using the scientific method to harness the power of science, like we did with the man who gave us the wonderful Salk Institute in San Diego, Jonas Salk, with a cure, a vaccine for polio. Do you know that polio has now been eradicated in Africa over many obstinate people's views, even in the United States, those people who believe these shots are going to cause autism in children, an unbelievably stupid way of looking at the great achievements of science in this country. From Salk to what we have today, science at work, the age of the scientific method that pushed the West in front of the world as the leaders towards a better world, not just in America, but everywhere. Not just for Jews or Catholics or Protestants or Mormons, but for everybody. And we had a court that represented the same. A great Supreme Court that tried to keep the balance, and famous presidents who actually got on the court. There's never been another president on the Supreme Court except for the man who got there under Harding, who had been president in the progressive era, Taft. And so it was that you find the world turning and America turning with it, turning into a place where there's room for all, where immigrants were welcome, where numbers of things could go right, some could go wrong. We've had crooks, even in the White House. Mr. Harding, he took a couple of people. He died before he could go to jail, but his members of his cabinet went to jail. Members of the cabinet of Richard Nixon, John Mitchell, an attorney general, no less, doing time. Strange are the ways of the American people. But we hang tough, we work hard, and by damn, we get there. Thank you for listening again today. The next time we meet, we actually will go to war with Woodrow Wilson. La Grande Guerre was very difficult for Americans. The rehearsal war for that war actually was the American Civil War. We had trench warfare around Petersburg at the end of the Civil War. We had the Gatling gun. All these things are going to reappear in the trenches of the Western Front. So we'll have to talk about that. Talk about Wilson's reaction, his final coming to terms with the war, the resignation of William Jennings Bryan. He would have no part in it. Blackjack pursing, leading the Americans foolishly off to a war they were unprepared for. Do you know that we sent over 1 million horses to World War I? Do you know how stupid that was? A horse against a machine gun? Do you know that we had no airplanes in World War I? We had to borrow the airplanes from the British and the French. It was an amazing war, but we got through it, and the West got through it, and the world got through it. And I'll be with you at war next week. Take care, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Patrick.